And we hear about South Pacific Island states from Anare Leweniqila from the permanent mission of Fiji to the UN. Thank you for being here, Anare, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Firstly, just let me take this opportunity to thank Caritas for the opportunity to be at this symposium and to share a few stories about the Pacific and the work that we are doing in Fiji. I think the earlier video provided a good segue into this session. Shall we stay or shall we go? Shall we go in 2030 in 7 years' time, or shall we go in 27 years' time in 2050? I think that is the message that the discussions on sea level rise and the Pacific, in that context, is that something that has been part of the conversation. It's also interesting that when we discuss slow onset, especially sea level rise, we know that the science is telling us that the sea levels will rise. But at what pace and at what level, only time can tell us that. But I think so far we have done predictions, modeling, to give us some idea of how we will see sea level rise in the future. But I think my presentation is basically just to try and make the connection between what the science is telling us and what is the reality when we look at the context of the Pacific Islands. I think in the presentation I just wanted to share the context of the Pacific when we look at sea level rise as a region, and then I will try and touch base on some of the work in Fiji when we look at internal migration and also in terms of looking at human mobility. I think in terms of looking at the reality of the situation in the Pacific. Before becoming a diplomat, I was the director for Fiji's Disaster Management Office. And one of the things that we noted in terms of the conversation when we talk about intensity and increased frequency, that is something that we are feeling in the Pacific. When I was the director, in one cyclone season, we had around 3 tropical cyclones and 3 massive flooding, just in one season. And also in terms of looking at other countries in the region, in terms of prolonged period of dryness. In the Pacific, you don't have what you call a drought, because the definition of drought under WMO is different from what we have in the region. So we call it a prolonged period of dryness. So when we look at the countries in the region, mostly the prolonged period of dryness is in the Northern Pacific. Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, those are where we are facing a lot of dryness. But in terms of looking at severe flash floodings and tropical cyclone, that is more towards the south, basically in Polynesia and Melanesia, in terms of the countries that are in that region. But when we're looking at sea level rise, as I've mentioned earlier, in terms of looking at what the science is telling us, we're looking at damaging king tides. Every now and then we have king tides. And we are looking also at saltwater intrusion when we are looking at the discussions that we're having in terms of sea level rise. So when we're looking at in terms of the frequency, in terms of the sea level rise, we noted this from the high level, the high water mark. We noted that it's moving in shore. Where we had houses before, we are no longer there. Sometimes we thought that it was just a normal phenomenon that goes according to time. But now with the discussions of climate change, and we know that the reality of sea level rise is something that we need to contemplate when going into the future. And also in terms of looking at the reality of the situation, a lot of us are coastal communities. Our lives are built around the coast. All our infrastructure, our schools, nursing stations, they are built around the coast because the sea is our mode of transportation. And now with the sea level rise in terms of the discussion that we're having, we are beginning to see the need to move some of this key infrastructure more towards the inland, just to ensure that we move it out of harm's way in terms of the discussions that we're having. King tides. One of the things that is high demand in the Pacific is the need to build seawalls. That is basically just to ensure that we protect the coast of our communities. As we say, if you might have been to some coastal communities, before we used to love to have our beaches, and then we can just walk down to the beach. Now that same beach is now a threat to us. A lot of the communities that we have are coming to government requesting for seawall, just to ensure that we avoid saltwater intrusion, and also just to protect the land that we have, where our villages and our communities are located. So when we look at what the science is telling us and the reality of the situation, we can say that actually sea level is on the rise. And that is something that we are planning in terms of looking at the discussions around the reality of the situation and the need to have conversations around sea level rise in every conversation or talanoa that we do in our communities. Some of the key considerations when we look at this in terms of the Pacific. One is habitability. In the Pacific, as I've mentioned earlier, we have Northern Pacific. They have very small land masses, small population, and boundaries will be an issue for them in the conversation on sea level rise. More towards the south, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, we have much bigger islands, and we know that in terms of looking at sea level rise, there is some form of adaptation that we can do. In the Northern Pacific, you can walk around some of those islands in 3 hours. So you can stand from this coast and you can see the coast on the other side. So for them, when we look at adaptation, for the future, there'll be limits to adaptation in terms of looking at hard infrastructure, sea walls, whether you want to raise the island. Those are some of the things that we have to take into consideration when we look at the limits to adaptation. In the South Pacific, like for example, Fiji, we have a lot of adaptation measures that we can undertake because we are much big islands. Nature-based solutions are some of the things that we can take into consideration. But also adequately of importance is to look at food security. We know what the science is telling about us about the ocean. The Pacific relies on the ocean for its source of protein. And also in terms of land, as I've mentioned earlier, with the frequent long periods of dryness, these are also issues for us in terms of those that have small land masses for planting food. For example, if you might heard in the media, the island of Kiribati has bought a piece of land in Fiji just to enable them to cultivate some food for food security purpose in case of any shortage. Then they can rely on that food to be imported or exported back for them as a source of sustenance. Water security, I think this is also an issue. We have rely a lot on boreholes, groundwater. I think with sea level rise, there's a lot of salinity in the water that we are having in some parts of the Pacific, and also in terms of looking at rain for those that have excessive rainfall in some parts leading to flooding. So this is one of the things that we normally have in the conversations that we have when we talk about sea level rise, in terms of the considerations that we have and the conversation, the intersection with climate change is that probably before even sea level rise affects the Pacific, some islands, there will be no one left there because there's no food and water. So when we're looking at the reality of the situation and when we're looking at sea level rise, this is something that we're trying to look at concretely in the Pacific in terms of countries, in terms of looking at adaptation strategies, and also in terms of looking at the big conversation that why we are here is on human mobility. And that is something that we have been having discussions on, and also in terms of the region, in terms of looking at the conversation on human mobility. So in terms of looking at what the science is telling us, what is the reality, and in terms of looking at sea level rise considerations, just to reflect a bit on the work that we are doing in Fiji in terms of internal displacement in relation to sea level rise, looking at displacement and relocation. I think when we're looking at it in this context, that's movement of people internally, that is something that we are focusing on right now. And in terms of looking at community relocation, we have our displacement guideline and our relocation guideline guiding the work of government in terms of communities that we need to be relocated. So far we have done 2. We have 60 that have come forward for request in terms of looking at their vulnerability, their level of exposure, and they have requested to be relocated. But we have done vulnerability assessment to look at which ones needs to be prioritized in terms of their level of exposure and vulnerability. So that is something that we are working on with donor partners in terms of looking at relocation as one of the options for climate change adaptation that we're having in the Pacific. As I've mentioned earlier, looking also relocation versus nature-based solutions. I think with sea level rise, different contexts that we have in the Pacific, those in the north that I mentioned earlier, nature-based solutions might not work for them. I think long-term movement or human mobility might be an option for consideration. But for those of us in the south, we are also looking at nature-based solution as one of the adaptation measures for climate change adaptation, and where last resort, then we look at the movement of our communities. Looking at a rural versus an urban approach, based on the work that we did in Fiji, I think it's always easy for us to relocate communal communities because it's the way our land is owned. Our land is owned by the people. So we can work with the people in terms of looking at the exchange of where we move one community to the other community, or we move it between a single ownership in terms of looking at an area that is safe. Within that same community's land ownership, then we can move them. Otherwise, we can look at working with other communities in giving up a piece of land for this community that needs to be relocated. And that is something that we can work on with community in terms of looking at consultations with community in terms of looking at an approach for relocation. For the urban approach, it's always very difficult because most of our land are called freehold land, and it's always very difficult to look at any options for relocation at the urban level given the nature of that land tenure system, and in terms of also looking at how best we can accommodate those in the urban areas, especially those living in informal settlements that are also vulnerable to any disasters that we have, and also in terms of looking at those kind of options then we need to look at in terms of those alternatives. As I've mentioned, that is also in terms of looking at the lands that we have and the way our land is owned, in terms of looking at those kind of ownership, which is part of the policies that we have. You know, we have a lot of islands. To move from one island to relocate to another island, then that means that this certain community might have to give up something for their future generation, for the current and those that want to move. So it's always a difficult conversation when you look at some of the options that we have. But as I've mentioned, in terms of looking at inclusive community approach, our policies inquire us that we do inclusive approach, community consultation. For the relocations that we have, it took us 2 years to be able to convince the community to move, and also for those landowners who will be providing their land to give the necessary consent for the relocation to take place. So it's always about an inclusive community approach, and there are also lessons learned in terms of some of the relocation that we have. And I think that is part of the ongoing process of improving the policies that we have, and also ensuring that the policies and also the relocation that we take is done in a very inclusive manner, and also it can sustain some of the communities that we have. So in terms of looking at sea level rise and the conversation that we are having at this symposium, I think in terms of looking at the regional scope, that is something that I think is always of interest. While we can move people internally at the national level by governments, I think the most sensitive part for the Pacific is looking at the movement of people across islands. As I've mentioned earlier, you know, we are very small, and also state sovereignty is a very important consideration when we look at the discussion. But in terms of the discussions that we are having in terms of movement of people across islands, I think probably next month the Pacific Island Forum is putting forward a framework for human mobility in the Pacific. And we had PDD, Professor Kaelin, involved in that conversation, is just to bring that discussion on movement in the region for our leaders for consideration, and that will provide a framework for how states and government discuss mobility in the region in terms of how we can address that. It's always a sensitive discussion when we bring it to the Pacific, where I was with Walter in one of the workshops in Suva. We were discussing displacement in terms of looking at human mobility, and the ambassador for Kiribati puts his hand up and said, "What are you talking about? We don't believe in that." That's not something that we are eager to discuss, but that is the nature of how we hold the conversation, but I said it's through Talanoa, it's through the framework that we are trying to bring to the Pacific, but at the end, it's the reality that one day they have to consider that option. In terms of looking at, just to end the discussion, in terms of the short presentation that I prepared, shall we stay or shall we move? I think for now the Pacific has decided to stay. Thank you.